All right, we made it to week 4 of popular culture, and we are going to be talking today a little bit about psychoanalysis and Freud. So let's get to it. All right, I have my buddy here, Eddie, who is going to help me illustrate a little bit of the Freudian psychoanalytic framework. I think he makes a pretty good id, and we'll talk about what that might mean in a second. But let me just first say a few things about Freud. One, if you're talking and studying about psychoanalysis, if you are studying psychology, you probably are not talking a lot about Freud. All right, I have my buddy here, Eddie, who's going to help me, hopefully, illustrate in a not too inconvenient way, because he's been barking a lot, what I'm talking about when it comes to the id, the ego, and the superego, which are Freud's terms, of course. And I mean, a lot of what we'll talk about today, you might realize is not 100% of Freud's work, and we're not going to get to that. And in fact, a lot of people spend their whole lives studying Freud and still don't fully understand him or a lot of his work. And so, yeah, no illusion that we're going to understand Freud today. If you've read the material, or if you've read Freud or heard of Freud, I think the biggest mistake you could make is thinking that you do understand him. Because, I mean, I've read many of his books. I have no illusion that I understand him. That isn't to say I don't understand anything, but I think a lot of people hear these basic terms like id, ego, superego, and they're like, oh yeah, I understand Freud. So no, very few, if anyone does. I don't think Freud understood Freud by the end of it. But there are some basic terms that we can talk about that can help us unpack pop culture ideas, which is where it gets kind of cool. And so he was interested in a lot of different things, but we'll talk about dreams and what he calls the dream work. And on a very basic level, the dream work is simply going from manifest to latent and back again. And we'll figure out how that works a little bit, and we'll have some examples. But first, let's think about the basic dynamic. And so, again, if you're taking psychology or you're taking neuroscience or something like that, you'll realize that there is no unconscious space in your head. What Freud was doing is talking about a general idea and set of sort of theoretical concepts, not a physical thing that is inside that you could say that's the id, that's the superego. So right off the bat, there's that, right? There's the theoretical, which we're talking about, but then there's the physical, which medical doctors would be talking about, which is different. That's why he's not usually brought up a lot anymore in actual medicine. But anyway, you have this iceberg, right? And on the iceberg, and that's why Eddie's here, although he's being really well behaved, which is surprising. Yeah, I think he thinks he's going to get a treat after, which maybe he will. Let me fix this. Anyway, so if you think about it, you have the ego, which is kind of like you, right? The mental idea of yourself and how you work. And much of that is on the surface, but some of that is maybe a little bit more buried below the surface when it comes to what you understand yourself. So if I ask you to reflect on yourself, you could say like, hi, I'm Chris, I believe in this, and I have these values, and so there's that, right? Then there's the superego, which is kind of like the father figure, the traditional patriarch, and that's what you learn often in society, maybe from school, maybe from your church, maybe from your peer groups, definitely from your parents in most cases. And so that's the voice inside of you that says, I better be good. And this is what good means, and that can vary from culture to culture, but generally, you don't kill, you don't pillage, you don't do all these really bad things, but also maybe you say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and these kinds of things, which is part of what your superego might be sort of in the back of your mind reminding you of. And then there's your id, which for me, this is a good representation of the id because he's very motivated by treats. When we first got him, he showed up at our door and he was humping everything. And so he had no father figure social construct about what you should or shouldn't be doing. He just, thought there's a leg, I'll hump it. There's another dog, Judy or Rupert. Anyway, it got a little awkward. But he did it because he was motivated by these sort of base instincts, right? He doesn't want to sit quietly. He doesn't want to do his homework. He wants to eat and partake in humping. I don't know what the best scientific phrase for that is. Yeah. Okay. So the idea that Freud had was that you have your society, and that shapes who you are in many ways, right? And then you have this competition between these three aspects. And the id kind of gets pushed down to the bottom. So we all have a little Eddie inside of us who is motivated by, generally two main ideas, right? Ideas that get sort of pushed down. So there's the violent, destructive instincts that we do all have on some level, right? If you get mad at a situation, you might instinctually want to punch somebody. And most of us, I hope, wouldn't. And that's because the id has this sense like, punch that guy in the face. He just said something mean. And then your super ego comes in, which maybe is like a father, or maybe is like a school teacher or whatever. But then that thing in your mind says, no, we're not doing that. And so that's the basic dynamic. I mean, we could get really complex, but that's the basic dynamic. And dreams help us figure that stuff out, according to Freud. And you don't have to agree with all of the things that you read, but try to understand it. And so where Freud's coming from is this idea that we have the unconscious and the conscious. A lot of the things we do, we think we know why we're doing it, but actually we're being motivated by this little Eddie or this id. And the id is the most basic sort of primal instincts, right? And most of the time that has to do with procreating and destroying or being violent, right? Those are two things that we do very much according to social expectations now, right? There are very few times that it's acceptable to be violent, but maybe in sports in certain ways, right? Maybe hunting, if you're in a society that accepts or that is cool with hunting animals, killing animals, eating animals, most people are okay with. And so there's all these ways that violence happens in our society, but in a very, very controlled way. Sexuality, while in some places it's more acceptable or less acceptable to be sexual or to show your sexuality, a lot of places are still concerned with marriage and with like sort of state-sponsored relationships, with procreation only in certain ways at certain times, and lots of super ego type of institutions will have opinions about those two things. But you also can't control your instincts on a basic level, right? They're gonna come out, but our society teaches us that, well, instead of going after everyone you think is attractive, how about you watch these movies in which people have romantic relationships, and then you can kind of live through that, right? Instead of murdering people when you're angry, why don't you play Call of Duty, and you can kind of murder people, but not for real, and that'll help get your aggression out, right? So we have all these ways of dealing with it, and dreams are a part of that. Freud talks about kids, and they have kind of basic dreams when you think about it. So, for example, if a little girl wants to eat chocolate, and her parents say, no, you can't, you can only have one cookie and that's it, then maybe she'll go to bed and she'll dream about cookies everywhere, like raining down cookies, or a candy land that she can, eat houses and everything that's available to her. So like all the candy she wants, right? She wants candy, she can't get it, dreams about candy. That's the basic level. Once we have all of these social barriers that say, this is how you should act with people, this is what is and is not appropriate, then we kind of come up with ways of dealing with it that are more and more complex, right? So let's say, for example, you're attracted to someone you shouldn't be, right? So society tells you, well, let's say it's a friend of yours who's already in a relationship, right? So it's inappropriate to go after them and try to get into a relationship with them. But you still have this desire, right? So maybe in your dream, what happens is that the person that your friend is with, like the reason that you're not able to get together, maybe that person dies in your dream, and then you're there to console that person, right? So you didn't really do anything bad, but you did kind of get what you wanted in your dream, and that happens in many complex ways, and often not that simply, right? But these are ways that your id says, I want to be in a relationship with that person. Your superego says, no, you're a good person, you're not going to ruin a relationship, or you're not going to do it in this way. And so you come up with some kind of negotiation during your dreaming. And this can happen, let's say you're very angry with your parents, but then your super ego says you shouldn't be angry. Your parents are people you're supposed to respect at all times. So you have this conflict. Your id is very angry. Maybe he wants to lash out at your mom or dad for not doing something or for doing something wrong. But your super ego says, no, you always respect your parents. So then maybe you have this dream where instead of lashing out at your parents, you lash out at a neighbor, or you lash out at a bad guy attacks your parents, and then you lash out at that person. And that's a way that you're able to get your frustration out, but also do it in a little bit more appropriate way. And then sometimes, as you probably know, dreams can get really crazy. So like, instead of, being able to lash out at your neighbor who's pissed you off, but you want to be a good neighbor and society tells you to be a good neighbor, instead, I don't know, like a flying unicorn comes in and takes over your neighbor's house, and then you have to fight it or something. Like, you know how crazy dreams can be, right? That's some of the ways in which we kind of deal with things that we want on a basic level, but we complicate them and make them sort of more acceptable. And so you might be asking, why are we studying this in popular culture? A few reasons. One, Freud helps us think about how our desires work, right? So we all have desires. You may or may not agree with Freud's interpretations, but if you start from this idea that we have these basic desires that oftentimes can't be fulfilled, or at least not fulfilled directly, right? We want to be violent towards somebody that's made us angry. Instead, we go and play this violent game. But sometimes we're still not satisfied, right? Or sometimes we still have these unfulfilled feelings. And so what we can do is we can dream and we can transform them in some way that makes it both acceptable, but also gets all that energy out. And so movies, television, there's a bug. Now I have a desire to punch this bug that's flying around. But just as an example, it's not socially unacceptable to like swat at bugs, so you can do that, right? It is socially unacceptable to punch a stranger, even if the stranger's being an asshole. And so that you might try to hide, whereas the desire to punch a bug or to do something that is acceptable, you don't have to hide. And so we don't tend to have a lot of dreams about stuff when we're adults that's obvious to us. What we have is our dreams that are really complicated, but once we unpack it, we realize, oh, okay, so this magical creature that came down and told me I needed to go on this quest is really a way for me to deal with this other thing that I've been putting off because I don't want to accept it, or because I don't want to acknowledge it, or because society tells me it's wrong to have those feelings. And so that's how dreams work. Films, television, books, basically almost all media allow us to do that as well. And in many cases, they construct our desires for us, right? So maybe you have a desire to be in a relationship with somebody. What Burger King will do, or what whatever company that's trying to sell you the newest car will try to do, is take that sort of sexual energy and transform it into an energy to buy this car. So effectively, it'll switch something, but it'll switch it for the thing that they want. Whereas your brain, your unconscious will switch it for a way that makes it more acceptable to you. Commercials are often trying to make it more acceptable so that you buy the thing, whatever that thing is, right? So I'll give you a few examples on the website that I want you to interpret. And what Freud says is basically, you do a few things in the dream work, but one of them is you translate what would otherwise be an argument, like this is the case, this is why I want this, and this is why I will pursue it in a different way. You translate that into visuals. So again, maybe you really want to lash out at somebody who's offended you while you were driving, but then you're someone who doesn't like to show any kind of rage or anything. And so instead, you have that built up, you come home, you fall asleep, and in this case, you're pursuing a bad guy who you have to drive really fast and you have to drive aggressively and you have to hit him off the road because you're saving the day. That's a much more acceptable thing to do, and so you maybe dream like that. But then even so, your unconscious might think to itself, because this is before it gets to you, right, to your consciousness. It might think, no, that's too obvious. Chris shouldn't be thinking these things, and so it transforms it again, right? So instead of you running someone off the road, someone runs you off the road, and that's a way of transferring that. So you still kind of get it, but it switches and you feel more comfortable. So these are some of the ways that you can transform, or that your unconscious transforms for you. Once you've learned sort of social rules, you learn how to visualize an argument, and you learn how to visualize it in a sense. That's why you have all these really vivid dreams often. You feel like you understand, but only based on images usually. You often don't have a lot of speaking in a dream. You almost never have words in the sense that like you're reading a book. Instead, you have just these images and these visions coming to you. And so that's one way that it gets translated. Another way it gets translated is, like I said, being more socially acceptable or switching the burden. So in other words, if you are being, if you're having feelings like you want to have an affair, and that's obviously not acceptable in society, then maybe somebody else has an affair or they propose an affair to you, and that's much more acceptable because you didn't do anything bad. They came on to you, but it's a way of switching that when maybe unconsciously you don't want to accept the idea that you might desire somebody else, right? So these are ways that Freud, often we think about Freud and sexuality and Freud and violence to a lesser extent because these are things that he talked about, but he said society doesn't like to talk about. And if you feel uncomfortable talking about this stuff, it kind of proves the point, right? It shows that you'd much rather watch probably a violent movie and not have to think about it than think about your own desires for violence. Or you'd much rather watch a romantic movie than think about your own desires for romance, because that's not as acceptable in many cases, right? So pop culture helps us deal with a lot of our desires in a way that Freud helps us unpack, even though Freud wasn't necessarily concerned with pop culture in that sense. So we can do a few examples, and I'll put them up. I'll show them here, and I want you to think about what desires are present that are being transformed. And the answer almost always is either sexual or violent. But how do they do that and for what purpose is something that's interesting to think about, that you can think about with Freud. So we have what's called the manifest content. And so in this ad right here, right, you can see there's like clearly, like it lacks any kind of sophistication. This message is clearly translating something into sexuality, and in particular, a heterosexual male point of view, basically saying that if you buy burgers here, that's just as good as having sex with a beautiful woman or something. So come buy our burgers, right? That's the way that you kind of, if it works, hopefully you guys are much too smart to fall for that kind of thing. But if it works, then what you get is you don't get the desire fulfilled, but the company gets you to buy their stuff, right? And so that's one kind of obvious way. Another maybe less obvious way is this image of a chicken, right? So this is, kind of a cute origami style chicken. And one of those things is so that you don't think about, so it strips the violence out of it, right? So it's much more acceptable to play with a little origami chicken than to maybe kill your own chicken or watch an animal die. And so often you switch into these kinds of things, right? And companies are very happy to do that for you, whereas Freud was more interested in how we do that for ourselves usually. There are a number of other ways we could do this. What does this ad sell, right? This Tom Ford ad? Clearly, you don't need to think about a number of these things that we're talking about. If all you're thinking about is, I need to buy glasses, I'll buy these glasses. But if somehow that desire or that need for sight, right, to be able to see, gets translated into, this is just as good as having sex with a beautiful person, then that's how advertising works. Of course, they don't want you to think about that. Because if you're thinking about it, it doesn't work unconsciously, it works consciously. And then you have to be like, well, obviously buying these glasses is not the equivalent to that. I don't know why they're even proposing that, but also they're not proposing that, not in any kind of formal sense, right? They're just associating it with images, which is what you do in your dreams and what a lot of advertising and mass media in general do in a less obvious way often. So that's taking the manifest, what it is that you're seeing, and it's it's getting to the latent content, which is the underlying meaning. So I want you to try to practice that a little bit this week. Look at stuff on TV or in magazines or whatever, right? What you see at first is the manifest content. This is the same as your dream. Like if you say, this was my dream, I had a battle in a magical land made of candy and this stuff happened, right? That's the manifest, that's what happens, or that's what you see. But then once you start to go back and ask, what do I associate with this image? And what have I seen lately that this image might have been inspired by? And what might it point to that maybe I don't want to acknowledge at first, but now that I think about it, I realize this does make me think of my friend or my family member or girlfriend or whatever, right? Once you start to unpack that and then you realize, oh, okay, so when I was attacked by a cookie monster in my dream, that's in some sense a way of me dealing with my anger and frustration at my brother who did this thing to me, and I still remember that time he was also mean to me at McDonald's or something, right? And so you can do that. It's hard to do it for real, because when you do it for real, you can kind of get emotional, because the whole point of all this is that you take those uncomfortable emotions and you bury them, and then you translate them into much easier things to deal with. So if you're doing it right, you actually can get pretty emotional. So be careful. But also, it helps you unpack a lot of the messages that are being subtly portrayed. Obviously, in media, they're often trying to get you to feel stronger, more powerful, and also sexier and more desirable, right? And by doing that, they kind of short circuit a somewhat more natural thing that goes on in all of our brains. So that's Freud and the fun you can have with him. I'll put some examples, and I want you to try to unpack for yourself what they might mean. And it's not enough to just say, well, this means sex or this means violence. How are they translated? Think about what he says in the dream work and how you might go from the manifest to the latent. And that's it. Enjoy your week. Enjoy your dreams. I'm sure you will have slightly more vivid ones now that we've been talking about this.